In modern age, the British Empire faced a challenge to the empire by Boer War that was fought in South Africa. And there was the birth of the Socialist Party. There was the Education Act of 18...
सर आवाज नहीं आ रही.
...20th century that is known for 2 world wars, and there was challenge to British Empire. There was rapid urbanization and shift of 70% population of Britain to the urban areas. There was democratization of institution and mass education. Mass education turned into popular literature for semi-literate low-brow readership. Popular literature for a semi-literate low-brow readership. There were soldiers in war who could read and write. In the past, soldiers were only, you can say, the war actors, and they were not able to read and write as we see the soldiers of First World War. There was tension between the popular and esoteric literature, popular and specialized literature, commercial and the avant-garde, and there was no systematic force like church, family, state. There was no hope of getting value from the institutions of the past. First and Second World Wars mark in time and in their effects momentous changes on a global scale. This kind of worldwide effect is the phenomenon of the century. English literature and ideas were in many ways harking back to the 19th century. Writers of that age, they were associated with a movement that is called modernism, and the psychological works of Freud, anthropological writing of Sir James Frazer, who wrote The Golden Bough, and impact of Darwinian evolution. Challenged religion, social stability, and ethics. Ultimately, there was chaos of values, Modernism produced a chaotic and difficult writing that it moved beyond the capacity of many readers, and these modernist writers became elitist. T.S. Eliot even furnished footnotes to help the reader with The Wasteland, and we know the footnotes of Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce are even larger than the size of actual novel. There were some writers who were writing in Victorian norms like John Galsworthy, a fiction writer, materialist, novelist, dramatist, and Arnold Bennett, who also continued to write in the same direction. Both were criticized by Virginia Woolf in her famous essay, Modern Fiction. So first, we see certain experiments and breakthrough in poetry, both in forms and treatment of ideas. And then we see similar experimentation in drama and novel. There was a theorist, Arthur Symons, who influenced aesthetics of late Victorian age, who published his study, The Symbolist Movement in Poetry. And symbolist movement in poetry is influenced by the French symbolist poets. He advocated for an idea that poetry is not statement or felt sensation. It was statement in Restoration age, and it was felt sensation of romantics. But poetry was an art. Modern poets like W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot were impressed by the ideas of the Arthur Symons. Arthur Symons brought home to British poets the significance of French experimental symbolists like Rimbaud, Verlaine, Lafont, and Mallarmé. These are French poets. W.B. Yeats drew the lesson that we must purify poetry, which was to continue through movements like imagism, vorticism, There were poets like Thomas Hardy who continued to write in lyrical mode. Hardy was a prolific poet, author of some 900 poems with an extensive range of feelings and attitudes. Some of these poems are gently ironic, some are strongly felt love poems, especially those he wrote following the death of his wife in 1912. Some are written in a mordantly comic light verse, and others show lament on the brevity and fragility of human life, and some poems are pessimistic. Another poet of the age is A.E. Housman. He wrote two shorter collection of poetry. A Shropshire Lad is his first, published privately in 1896 and became best-selling and best-loved books of poetry. It is said that it was the one volume of most of the soldiers in trenches in the First World War carried with them. यानी श्रॉपशायर लैड वो कलेक्शन ऑफ पोइट्री है जो वार सोल्जर्स अपने साथ लेके गए फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर में. The poems speak of love and loss, of the English countryside and season, the passing of time and death, reflecting the lost love and ending a passionate attachment in the writer's own life. In 20th century, first Georgian poets attracts our attention. Georgian poetry takes its name from King George V, who reigned from 1910 to 1936. But actually, Georgian poetry does not have the similar length of about 26 years. It has shorter period of 4 or 5 years, we can say, till the beginning of First World War, from 1910 to the breakout of war. A great many of the most significant poets of Georgian time are Rupert Brooke, D.H. Lawrence, Wilfred Sassoon, Isaac Rosenberg. Robert Graves, one of the central figures in English poetry for more than 50 years. His first published work appeared during the First World War, and he was associated with the publication of Georgian poetry. He wrote a considerable amount of poetry between then and his collected poems in 1975. He uses a wide range of poetic forms and subjects, but it is for his love poetry that he is known, encompassing a wide range of feelings and attitudes at a time when intellect rather than emotion tended to dominate the literary scene. Robert Graves was never popular as a poet, but towards the end of the century, His reputation has enjoyed something of a revival, and he is now seen as a major lyric poet. Georgian poetry was short-lived. We can say more probably the best poet will be A.E. Housman, or another Georgian poet who later on emerged as war poet, Edward Thomas. Georgian poetry was short-lived, and then there was trend of imagism or imagist poetry. There is an anthology, The Imagist, edited by Ezra Pound. Imagist poems tend to be short, sharp glimpses, and contrast with the lushness of romantic and Victorian verse. They are sparse, they are precise, they use an image, and image is suggestive. And in this way, imagist poetry that is shorter and that is rich in its texture and suggestivity. Imagism was a movement designed to replace the soft, discursive, narrative voice of Victorian poetry with a harder, more condensed imagist language. D.H. Lawrence, a prolific poet, though he is best known as a novelist, penetrate deep into the essence of living things and shares certain traits of imagist poetry. He wrote descriptive poetry, narrative poetry, love poetry, and satirical words to philosophical meditation, like his poem, The Ship of Death. Then there is Antiwar Poetry, which is also called Poetry of Trench. Wilfred Owen, Isaac Rosenberg, and Siegfried Sassoon are significant name of that poetry. At the beginning of the First World War, the characteristic response to it was that to serve in the war was a matter of duty. Poetry was written in order to express a sense of honor and to celebrate the glories of war. That was an initial response to war, because war was idealized, and its example is The Soldier, a poem written by Rupert Brooke, who believes that English soldier represents the English essence. If I should die, think only this of me, that there is some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. If an English soldier dies fighting against the enemies at any war front and he is buried there, the land is fortunate that through this soldier, England has reached that land. So foreign lands are being turned to English land through the dying soldiers. The Soldier is a romantic sonnet and deeply patriotic. It almost celebrates the values of the liberal culture of Brooke and his contemporaries. Rupert Brooke enjoyed an image of a golden boy from a golden age persisted after his death. His poem, The Soldier, is one of the last poems which unashamedly evoked patriotism. It contrasts significantly with irony of Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum. It is uh, it is false to lie that it is sweet to die for one's nation. So, what was claimed in A Soldier by Rupert Brooke, that uh, patriotism and nationalism are the highest ideal, and soldier can sacrifice his own life for the sake of these ideals. It is exposed how foolish young men are made cannon fodder. Horrors of First World War marked the end of a phase of Western European liberal culture. In 4 years from 1914 to 1918, over 9 million lives were lost from Europe. The British Commonwealth and the USA, they lost their lives for the sake of that so-called First Great War. Deep psychological wounds were cast in the minds of survivors, and a physical and metaphysical wasteland was created across the continent. Disillusioned poets Wilfred Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, they reacted against this reality in poems such as the title They and the General. Sassoon was one of the first poets to point to the consequences of war for the maimed and disfigured soldiers. The language of Sassoon's poetry is deliberately anti-romantic, and it's a rejection of conventional poetic diction in favor of sharp and biting colloquialism. Though Sassoon Sassoon was actually veteran of First World War. He didn't die in the war like Wilfred Owen, who actually lost his life at a very young age. So Sassoon afterwards produced different types of poetry, but his war poetry is very harsh and direct. First major poet of First World War, Wilfred Owen, began writing poetry in the manner of John Keats, but his poetry underwent stylistic changes as he toughened and tightened his language under the pressure of traumatic frontline experience. He is known for the use of half rhyme. Half rhyme is a technique that is used by Wilfred Owen. Another poetic device which he borrowed from John Keats, that's called synesthesia. Anthem of Damned Youth, Dulce et Decorum, these are his title of his poems, which describe the horror of a gas attack while commenting ironically on the limits of patriotism. Owen came to see it instead as a duty to warn of the horrors of war and to ask why political rulers allowed such mass destruction to continue for so long. One of Wilfred Owen's technical qualities is also illustrated in the lines. Owen's innovative use of half rhyme, for example, tall and toil, that is example of half rhyme, and it can be seen in his poem Fatality. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? Whereas full rhyme would inappropriately underscore a sense of pattern and completeness, use of half rhyme reinforces a sense of things not fitting and being incomplete. So through his poetry also he gave that notion that war is not normality, it is death of normal life. Owen also concentrated on the sound effects of his poems. The result is lines which reproduce the sounds of war. For example, Anthem for Doomed Youth is his poem where he says, "What passing bells for those who die as cattle. Only the monstrous anger of the guns can patter out their hasty orisons." When Wilfred Owen says he is not concerned with poetry, he means the kind of poetry associated with group. The First World War saw the death of millions of men. It saw the death of Victorian forms of poetic expressions and the radical questioning of liberal values. But it also saw the birth of a new realism, mean that's a realism which is not seen in everyday life, but it was experienced by the soldier poets who spent their lives in trenches. Isaac Rosenberg, Edward Thomas, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen are their examples. Poetry of nature was not ignored during the war. The work of Edward Thomas is based on English countryside, like A. Housman and in As the Teams Had Brass, which is at the same time a celebration of the land and of working on the land. Edward Thomas' best known poem is Adele's Top, which is an evocative, nostalgic remembering of a train stopping at a deserted country station. So desolate, barren nature that is shown in the poetry of Edward Thomas. Edward Thomas died very young and he lost his life in a shell shock attack. Antiwar poetry that is actually contributed to form a genre that we say anti-war literature in 21st century, and that got more popularity during the war on terror after 9/11. First World War writer, Second World War writer, they have been reconsidered and they have been revalued, and their poetry, their fiction, their dramas are being used to develop a contemporary genre that is called war literature. But First World War poetry, or even later on Second World War poetry, is not representative of modernist or modern poetry. Their true representation is through modernist poets like W.B. Yeats, W.H. Auden, Ezra Pound, and T.S. Eliot.